Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming and spending some of your Friday afternoon or morning, depending on where you are in the country, with us. This is the fifth online webinar that Tiny Opera House is hosting for small and startup nonprofit organizations. And today we are going to talk about the board. The board is a tricky subject for organizations of all sizes. The It's particularly interesting in startup organizations or in young organizations uh, because you're most likely building this from scratch. You probably filed paperwork originally that has maybe your family members or friends on the board. It's just something to kind of get started. But we're talking about some strategies for not only understanding what the board does in an ideal world, but how to run board meetings and how to recruit new board members to be helpful for the organization. A little bit of my background. If you've been to these before, you've heard this, but my name is Hampton Dorman. I've got a decade of experience running small and startup organizations of my own, mostly arts organizations on the East Coast. And through that process, I've had my own challenges with the board, and every mistake I've made along the way has helped inform some of the information that's in this PowerPoint. Because it is a tricky thing, and if it's a new concept to you, there's a little bit of a learning curve there for understanding, what is the board supposed to do? How do I communicate with the board? How do I get them excited about the work and leverage their talents to really benefit the mission of the organization? So what is the board supposed to be doing? I think this is sort of the central question that we're going to talk about first. And we'll start by looking at the responsibilities of the board. The board, I think, foremost has a fiduciary responsibility. And fiduciary is a word that we kind of use in reference to boards a lot. It basically means that they're responsible for looking out for the long-term financial health of the organization. They also have a legal responsibility. There are legal rules and best practices that govern how nonprofits are supposed to work. They also have an ethical responsibility, maybe not stated so clearly, but they are responsible for making sure that our organization is operating in an ethical framework. And they have a responsibility to the mission to make sure that we are helping the people who we say we're helping, and that we're effectively using the resources at our disposal to affect change in the communities that we're focused on. Your board should help you raise money. This is a fact that is sometimes hard to get over. If you've been in one of our previous webinars, we do talk about the kind of realities of this world that we live in the nonprofit sector. Raising money is one of them, and the board has a big responsibility to be part of that. The board should keep you compliant. They are the ones who look out for the legal interests of the organization, and also make sure that you are following in best protocols as dictated most of the time by the state that you're in, geographical state that you're in. They should make it so that you're doing as much as you can for the mission. This is sort of their job, more theoretically about what they're there for. They should champion the organization. They should be out in the community telling all their friends how great the work you're doing is, to really bring people into the organization and to raise awareness about the work you're doing in the broader context of your community. Those are the board's responsibilities. You, as an executive director, also have responsibilities to the board. You are responsible for engaging board members. These are folks who have value to offer the organization, and you are responsible for getting the most out of them by helping them connect with the mission, helping them connect with their peers, and engaging them in the work we're doing. You are responsible for respecting the board members, understanding that their time is valuable, that their what they're bringing to the table is valuable. This was a hard one for me, and I've made missteps in earlier parts of my career. You're responsible for communicating to the board about what you're doing, what your vision is, what's coming up on the calendar. In small organizations, this can be hard because If you are an executive director without any other staff, you're sort of out there doing the work on your own. But it's your responsibility to realize that the board is part of this work as well, and you need to communicate what you're doing and what your plans are with them. You're responsible for valuing their commitment. Board members are giving of their time, of their resources, and they need to see that those gifts are valued by the organization. It's kind of down the road of donor stewardship, but you need to make sure that they feel like their work is important and their contributions are important. And somewhat ironically, your responsibility is to manage the board. We'll talk sort of at the very end about the board leadership paradox, where they are the ones who are the stewards of the organization, but you as the executive director kind of work for them, but then also are responsible for sending the materials and managing their calendar and managing their involvement and their engagement with the organization in a way that can be sort of a interesting power dynamic that's hard to get used to. Your responsibility is to empower the board. You need to make it so that they feel ownership of the organization and that they are justified in taking actions on behalf of the organization. This is also sometimes uncomfortable if you're a kind of sole proprietor style executive director. It means giving up some of your control over the organization, but in doing that, you're building a bigger family and building a bigger resource set for affecting the change that you're looking to do with your mission. And the other side of that is trust. You're responsible for trusting the board members. If they are empowered, you need to trust that they have the best interest of the organization, of the mission in mind, and believe in what they're doing to help further both of those. You and the board are ultimately on the same team. Doesn't always feel like that, but it's true. In the best cases, the board and the executive director are working hand in hand. You do work for the board ultimately. If you were to distill kind of the biggest high-level view of what a board does, hiring the executive director and managing them is one of their key functions. So they're kind of your boss. Again, it's kind of tricky because it goes both ways. But ultimately, you both work for the mission of the organization. If you're trying to save the whales, save the puppies, save the kids, that is your ultimate responsibility, is to the mission and to the work that you're doing, and you're both on the same side working towards that. Ultimately, a great nonprofit needs a great board. You can get pretty far with having sort of a shadow board that doesn't really do anything. At a certain point, you're going to be limited in how you can grow and how you can continue to do the work that you want to do and accomplish the things that you like to see in your community without really building and engaging a great board behind you. Roles of board members, we'll talk about a couple different key functions that they can provide as individuals. Of course, we have elected offices in the board. Generally, these are chair of the board. There's usually a treasurer and almost always a secretary. These things actually vary state by state in terms of the legal requirements of who needs to be on your board, what's the minimum number of members on your board. There's a good resource here, and you'll get this PowerPoint sent to you as a PDF, and you can click on this link. It'll give you, a big overview of board responsibilities, officers, and some other sort of compliance issues governed by the states. Again, we are businesses registered in the states that we're working, so state rules apply to how the organizations have to function. There are a variety of types of board members, and each of them has a really key role to play. I tried to make all of these alliterative with mixed success. So in the chat window that we have, if you can think of any better names for these than I've come up with, I'd love to update these slides and some better ideas. Fundraisers, there are fundraisers on the board. It's a key function. Not everyone can be a fundraiser. Not everyone wants to be a fundraiser, but there are people who can give to the organization of their own resources and have connections and the ability and the inclination to make introductions and asks of other people specifically for financial support for the organization. There are people who want to be on the board because they like the mission and they like the work that you're doing. They're program propagators. They're involved because they want to be part of executing the work, or they want to be involved in shaping how we are affecting changes in our community. There's a great role for them on the board, sometimes not a great place for them, but we'll talk a little bit about how you can make the most of people who want to be on the board just because they want to be involved in the mission of the organization. Finance folks, these are people who are out there. It's nice to find someone to help you understand the financials, to kind of be looking out for, like I said earlier, the long-term financial health of the organization. Someone that understands how to read, finance statements and can be part of financial deals. Folks to help follow the rules of the organization, both in how meetings are run and also in compliance and in the rules governing how organizations have to function by state. These are really great folks to have around. It's hard to keep track of all the rules and run all the programs and do everything. So it's good to have folks on the board who like to do that type of work. Folks who are community leaders, who are there because they love the place that you're doing the work, and they are sometimes kind of figureheady people within the community. These can be good board resources, mostly from a marketing perspective to help get the word out. Also from a program credibility standpoint, especially if you're working in neighborhoods that have sort of, complicated histories and complicated power structures. Folks who understand how the world works in those neighborhoods can be really great assets on the board. And sometimes you need people to actually help you do the work. We call this a working board, where, if you're small and you need someone who's going to be there volunteering, or they're, running the programs with you, your board members can do this role. I think it's a slippery slope to go down because the board has real work to do that's separate from the program execution parts of our organizations. Sometimes we need these when we're just getting started. You need, your team is the board and the executors of programs. Ultimately, those end up being different things, but it's very understandable. It's kind of part of the life cycle of growth of an organization, to where your board really gets, can be focused on things that only a board member and only a board organization can do, and the folks who are helping you do the work are volunteers or on some other sort of committee. All these roles are valuable. It's mostly a matter of strategy in understanding what composition you need from the board when you're building one. And also, it's helpful to understand motivations and interests of the board members so that you can make sure you're giving them a valuable experience and something that makes them want to come back and continue to be part of the organization. I want to talk about a committee structure approach to running the board. I think it's helpful not only in a sort of understanding what the board roles are generally, but also I think it's really helpful as a structure to get the most out of the folks on your board, and to make sure that you're taking advantage of each individual member's unique contributions to the board. Again, using a committee structure helps you get the most out of your board. Some of the benefits of a committee structure: it elevates the contributions of key members of the board. So if there are people with a deep finance background, putting them on the finance committee is a way for them to really shine and get that unique engagement. That's somebody who, is a community champion or is a program propagator, doesn't necessarily want to have to do it all. You can assign different roles to different parts of the board and have them kind of do that work independently. It's also great because board meetings tend to always run over in time, but should be, as targeted as possible. Using committees helps keep some of the details out of general meetings. Finance is a great example. You've got people on the finance committee that can review the details of all the financials and then report to the board at a general meeting that they have reviewed it and everything's okay, or here's the things to look at. It keeps meetings on track because it's hard to get all of your board together in the same room, and you generally only have it once a month, sometimes maybe even once a quarter. So committee structure helps you take care of the detail work in smaller groups when you're all together talking about things that you can only talk about when you're all in the same room. You don't have to get distracted with all the details of what folks on the board are working on. It makes running meetings really easy. We'll look at a sample agenda later, but if you've got committees for each of these, big bullet points of what happens in a meeting, just assigning committee reports. I mean, each committee will have someone in charge of it, and their report to the board kind of splits up the responsibilities of running the meetings, and it makes it really easy to control the flow of those meetings. And it gets more work out of your board members. Instead of meeting just once a month or once a quarter, they've got to meet independently on their own in interim periods. So you're sort of getting more board level work out of the folks on your board. And again, that's because they're doing a lot of this work in between general meetings and then doing reports to the full board. So that's how you can get more work out of these folks. Some of the key committees, and again, these are you can have any of these that you want. You can have none of these. It's helpful in thinking about the committees. It informs kind of overall what board functions and board structure looks like. Finance committee, of course, I talk about that first because that's my background is in finance. Finance committee is great because they can review things off-site and then kind of just bring the highlights to the full board. Governance committee, governance is another word that we kind of only use when we're talking about boards or parliamentary meetings or things like that. These are the rules people. These are the folks who help keep meetings on track. They also help make sure that the organization is compliant and doing what its legal responsibilities are. Development committee. Development means fundraising. I don't know why we use the word development. It means fundraising. But in a development committee, these are your fundraisers. These are the folks who are responsible for finding new people that can financially contribute to the organization. Program committee. I think it's great to have folks that want to be very programmatically involved, have their own meetings. You kind of don't want too much program critique or suggestions coming up in the full board meeting because that's a rabbit hole you can go down forever. So having a committee where those folks can really chime in and voice their opinions and their ideas about program work is great. A nominating committee. This is sometimes part of the governance committee. I wanted to highlight it just because it highlights another key function of the board. The board can be and should be responsible for recruiting new people to be on the board, and that's what the nominating committee is there for. This is a smaller group that can identify potential board members, have initial conversations, sort of tee up meetings for you as the executive director. And it's great to have somebody focused on that all the time because it's sort of a continual challenge, just like donor management. It's a kind of continual effort to get the right people on the board and engage with the organization. And the executive committee, this is a sort of easy one. Sometimes this is mandated in state documents that you have to have one of these. It's basically all the officers and the executive director, and they can sort of act on their own to do things on behalf of the full board. Is why we have that. So roles of the finance committee, we talked about this a little bit already. They can go through all the details. They can look at all the stapler expense and paperclip expense and variable month over month dishwashing detergent spending, all that stuff that's really important to be looking at. And as the executive director, that's something that hopefully you're on top of and looking at all the time as well. It's great to have a touch point that gets in the weeds with it, that then can bring sort of the summary findings to the board so that the full board doesn't have to be concerned with all of that. They just have to really trust the finance committee. They're the ones that understand projections, that are not only understanding what we're spending money on now, but where we're going to be spending money in the future. And they can make high-level financial decisions. A lot of times things like insurance, whether or not to engage in loans or credit cards, or if you get to the point where you've got money that's invested in sort of in an endowment or something like that, the finance committee can make those particular sort of like really focused financing type things. Like, the full board doesn't need to be reviewing all the terms in an insurance document, but that's something great for the finance committee to do, because they're ideally people of that mindset that understand the nuances of financial instruments and how they play in with the organization. We've also got governance committee. These are folks there to ensure that the organization is following the rules of nonprofits as dictated by the states, as dictated by the IRS. Also in making sure that meetings are run appropriately. There are rules that govern how minutes need to be recorded, when voting of board members needs to happen, things like that. That's all the purview of this governance committee. They are also responsible for onboarding new board members, to helping new folks understand what's required of them from their board service and their board membership, so that they can be effective and kind of hit the ground running. And they're the go-to for either compliance or legal issues. These tend to be the kind of lawyery folks. If you've got a lawyer on the board, they're generally good fits for governance committee. Compliance, legal kind of things all fall under the governance committee. Development committee, these are your fundraisers. Their role is to identify new donors and make introductions and set meetings. They are kind of there to tee up new relationships for you as the executive director to come in and then be the champion of the organization and tell them why it's important to give to the organization and all the great things you're doing. But having someone make an introduction for you is huge, especially if they're known to the members of the development committee. It can really save you a lot of time. We talk about donor management in terms of how many touches you need to build that relationship so that you can make that ask. You can really kind of skip a bunch of steps if you've got someone that personally introduces you and kind of vouches for you and the organization. Program committee, these are folks that want to talk about the mission work and want to be involved in the programs. It is great to have folks like this on the board. It's also great to stick them in a committee so that the board meetings as a whole are not distracted or derailed. We'll talk about the fight against derailing in board meetings. That new program ideas. People love to brainstorm about this, and they love to think of new ways to execute on the mission. That's of course why we're all here. In this with our particular nonprofits. We believe in the mission and we're excited by it. You can waste a lot of time in board meetings brainstorming and having ideas of, oh, we should do this, oh, we should do this, or oh, have we done that? It's great input to get from folks on the board that are interested in thinking about that. It's also great to stick them in a committee so that they don't make everyone have to think about it in the general meetings. They can also look at things like the impact of, is the work we're doing having the effect that we are hoping for in the community, in general kind of program things that go down that execution of the mission type work. A nominating committee. This again is something that sometimes is part of the governance committee, but I think is important uh, depending on your situation, to have separate, or at least acknowledge it as a separate important task from what the governance committee does generally. These are folks that help you find new board members, similar to the fundraising committee and finding new donors. These are folks that have relationships, that know people who maybe they're other fundraisers, or maybe they're other community members. It is also a relationship game, and this is the sort of go-to starting point for that pipeline of getting new board members that you sort of always need to have turned on, because you never know if people are going to step off the board or things like that. It's an awareness thing that I think is important to have kind of all the time. Similar to the fundraisers, they're making introductions, they're setting meetings for you, and this can be part of the governance committee, but it is of significant importance that I wanted to kind of separate it. And there are lots of organizations that have separate nominating committees that work really well. Executive committee, this is governed just based on who the board officers are. And again, the number and kind of roles of board officers are dictated at the state level. But the folks who are elected, along with the executive director of the organization, who is generally not a board member, but is considered staff, have their own sort of powerhouse committee that is capable of making high-level decisions that can be made on behalf of the full board. Sometimes this is dictated, in the bylaws of the organization. What can the executive committee do versus what can the full committee do? But basically, executive committee can meet more often because it's a smaller group, and they can make decisions in interim periods between board members, or between board meetings. Board recruitment. A lot of what we're going to talk about is, folks who are starting out with new organizations or are managing small organizations don't always have the boards that they need. It takes a while to build a really high functioning board. As you get bigger in an organization, and on the top end of the scale, there's a lot of time goes into thinking about the board and managing the board. When you are kind of starting out or new to this, sometimes it's hard to get the traction, to get the folks you need. So we'll talk about how do you pick board members, and how do you recruit them to be interested in your organization. As you've heard me talk about in other webinars, everything starts with strategy. That's where we had that workshop first. Think about how do we really understand the work that we're doing as a nonprofit, and that drives everything else. It drives fundraising, it drives programs, it drives events, and it drives board recruitment. Understanding what you are looking to do with the organization will then help you understand who are the board members that need to be on your team to help you get there. So as an example, if you are in one neighborhood and you're looking to do new programs in another neighborhood, that of course has various ramifications. It's going to cost money. Fundraisers, almost all these decisions are going to cost money, so fundraisers are kind of a crucial piece of board membership. But in this example, if you're going into a new neighborhood and you don't have experience with the sort of political power structure dynamics in that neighborhood, somebody who is a neighborhood champion or who's from there, on this programmatic side, can help build relationships and inroads into that part of town. If, for example, you're adding a new service line, again, there's a theme here. It's going to cost money. Everything costs money. So you always need to think about who your fundraisers are on the board. New services need new relationships, just like in new geographies. Who are the folks who can give you program credibility on the work you're doing. And expansions can be tricky if you're taking the organization in a slightly different way. Folks to help keep that all part of the same organization and to help keep things running smoothly. These, are your governance folks, your rules folks. So do you have the right people in place to do what you're planning to do in the future of the organization. You can also think about this as building a roster based on needs. Uh, every board, every organization has certain needs. They also, are very specific to individual situations. But in general, you need to have board members that understand finance. So if you don't have someone that does this, or if you feel like this is a weak area, this can become part of your intentional recruitment for finding new board members. You're then not only not just looking for a new board member, but you're looking for a new board member that can help uh, you understand and manage the financials. Program credibility is huge. If you're doing work with certain populations, having someone who can either speak to that experience or represent other folks or academics or kind of that program line of work. Those are folks. Do you have enough people on your board that do that? Do you have people on the board that know what you're supposed to do in a nonprofit? There are a lot of rules in these organizations, from running meetings to complying with state requirements and IRS things. Do you have enough of these people? Do you have board members that can find you other board members? These, kind of community connector folks, or, sometimes this overlaps with finance. So rich people that have rich friends, do you have enough of those on the board? People that can raise money, either from their own pockets or through their relationships. Folks who can help with the marketing and the community presence of the organization. Or those folks, do you have enough of those on the board? Do you have go-to members on the board that, if things get tricky or you run into a difficult situation, who are you able to call that, can roll up their sleeves and be part of helping figure out complicated problems. So this is sort of, all things that you need in an organization. So looking at where you are currently with your board and who's on it, comparing it to sort of those lists or lists of folks that are going to be needed for moving forward in the strategy of the organization. So, identifying that and then looking at where the gaps, and this will help you figure out who are the types of board members that you're looking for. Ultimately, we want to find board members to fill roles that we need in the organization, and not the other way around, right? We want to purposely go after board members to fill certain needs of our board, not we're going to get a board member because they want to be on it, and then we'll find something for them to do. Ideally, you want to go, finding the need and then finding the person to fill that need, which is great, but finding these people can be really complicated, especially if you're new to this type of work, if you're new to this sort of presence in your community. A couple great places to look we'll talk about. Ultimately, board recruitment is relationship building, just like in donor management. Finding new people, new sponsors. It takes a while to build relationships with these people. So once you've identified, I need to have program credibility, I need to have one more person that helps give me program credibility in the work that I'm doing. Then from there you identify a couple sources, you work with the board, and then start to build those relationships. The first encounter is never the encounter that you want to ask them to be on the board. They need to kind of on their own make up their mind that the work that you're doing is important. So this is why we call it a long tail. It's something that takes a while. It takes a number of meetings before that ask is going to be successful. So you're not going to find new board members overnight. It takes a while, and that's why it takes sort of a continual focus on who are these people going to be in the future. For some ideas about who to even approach to start building relationships, we talked about this with donors as well. Look at other organizations that are doing similar work in your area. Who's on their board? Who is giving to them? Who are the individuals that are giving to them? If you're on the smaller side of an organization, you can target people that you don't necessarily need the board chair of the United Way to be part of your organization, but someone else on that board who is not an officer for you might be a really great find and might be able to lead your board and your organization. And this is all published online. Look at their websites. They almost always have members of the board. If you want to get more complicated, you can look up their IRS filings to see who's on their board. donors, they're always going to thank them somewhere. That's part of how we show and are able to give value back to our donors, is by publicly celebrating that they gave us money. So that's a good way to find out who gave money to the United Way, who gave $5,000 to the United Way. That person might be someone suitable for a board role in our organization. Local business owners can be great. Again, they give some community weight. Chambers of commerce have organizations. They've already brought a bunch of these folks together. They're a good place to look for potential board members. Community leaders, people who are out and visible in the areas that you're trying to work, can be really valuable. Sometimes elected officials can be helpful. So city council, county commission, school board, they typically are bad board members because they've got their own things going on and their own agendas. It can help from a opening doors perspective sometimes to say, the city council member is on our board. But, again, in understanding what role they're going to play and where, what they're going to help you with in the board is going to be on that community relevance and that, kind of marketing piece. So it's sometimes a good idea, sometimes it's not. Young professional groups, I think, are a great source for this. There's a lot that I've seen in the training of these that is helping folks be more philanthropically minded. These people are not necessarily going to have experience, with board service, but can have connections of their own, and can be really sort of eager to have this experience, and will work a lot to be part of it. I think it's a great place, especially for young organizations or small organizations where you don't need a billionaire philanthropist on it. Someone like this can really help fill those needs that we talked about earlier. From a nominating committee, if you have one. If not, having your existing board say who are their friends that they think might be good fits. They are a great resource to help you find new people to be on the board. Existing donors are sometimes good board fits. Somebody who's given to the organization before or has kind of stepped up in an important way to be a donor. These can be good folks to be part of that fundraising sort of aspect of the board. It's also important to remember that for small organizations and for new organizations, you do have some advantages to offer board members that you don't necessarily get in a large organization. A board member on the symphony is going to have a higher threshold to being sort of a big shot deal on that board because it's likely a bigger organization than the summer camp, a summer music camp that still has that same kind of mission of bringing music into the community. But you can give people an elevated stage that they might not have had the opportunity to have based on where they are financially in their career or professionally as they develop. So that's something to keep in mind, that there are some unique things you can offer, both in terms of experiences you can give people and the opportunity for them to be the chair of a board at the $5,000 donation level. It's something that's unique, that has value to certain folks. So just keep that in mind as you're looking and developing relationships with potential board members. Ultimately, I think it's also really, really important to remember that this is a real job. Being a board member is a real job, and a good board can really be helpful and is at a certain point will be critical in your ability to grow and continue to deliver these programs. So, just cautioning against, putting your cousin on the board or putting your mom on the board, your friends on the board. It's a real job. So being professional in how you're thinking about who needs to be on this board and understanding the weight that it has, I think is really important. So I want to put that in here. And once you have board members, it's important to try to keep them, right? You've got to retain board members the same way that you retain donors. Some key things that can be helpful there is, board members, just like donors, need to feel respected and valued for their contributions to the organization. So, always saying thank you, always going out of your way to tell them how important they are. That sort of, continual relationship management is important. They need to feel like part of the family, that they are a critical piece of how the impact happens in our communities, and they need to feel that. They need to understand that. There's some strategies in onboarding too, like when you have new people coming into the board, making sure that they feel welcomed by the board as a group of people, and that they're not just sort of showing up and no one talks to them and no one's really told them what they're supposed to do. Any of that kind of uncertainty feeling is is a kind of thing to watch out for. Uncertainty is a very uncomfortable emotion that makes people not want to do things anymore. So making sure that they feel like a family, not only with the mission work that you're doing and with the team that's executing on the programs, but also feeling like part of a group and socializing on that board level is really important to keeping folks engaged. Any questions on that? Any of that? It's a lot of information. There's a lot in this presentation. We're going to see how far we get in an hour, but I'll also send it out to everyone as a PDF so that you can have these as kind of guide points if we don't get through everything. I want to talk next about board meetings. There are some really helpful strategies in thinking about engaging the board. This is sort of your main way that the board all gets together and is able to be part of the organization, is through these meetings. So understanding what meetings are supposed to accomplish and how you can sort of keep things on track and get the most out of them, I think is really important, both for the value you're going to get out of the board and also for the board seeing you as this expert who understands how this all works and really the leader of the board, the organization, and the mission. You are ultimately the champion of all of this work, and the board needs to feel that. And a lot of times the main way they're going to interact with you in this capacity is through these board meetings. So again, they're really important. So having a plan and planning ahead is also really important. Planning ahead for board meetings means that you set an agenda and sent out materials in advance so that they've had a chance to look at things if they want to, that they're not sitting down and again feeling uncertain or feeling like you don't know what you're doing. Showing that you're prepared by sending this stuff out and being able to put it all together in advance of the meeting is really important. Make sure that you've addressed items from the last meeting. There's almost always a kind of old business, new business section of the agenda. I personally, in board meetings, I take a lot of notes on the agenda, and I will then go back and highlight ones that are things that board members said that I need to follow up on. Like if they say, "Oh, you should talk to Susan at the Red Cross to see if we can partner with them." Those are really important things to make sure you remember and to follow up with the people that suggested it. So making sure that you've done your homework from the last meeting, making sure you have a goal for the meeting you're in. You're not ultimately the one who leads the meeting, but you are the one who has a tremendous amount of control on the direction and the tone and the sort of emotion and how people end up feeling at the end of the meeting. All this sort of nuancy stuff is super, super important with the board. You want them to come away from that meeting understanding what you need them to do, where you need help, what you want them to focus on. So having a goal for the meeting is really, really, really important. Always have a goal for the meeting. I can't stress this enough. What do you want to accomplish in the meeting? Is it, some examples of this are, you are worried about the fundraising goals for the gala that's coming up. So you want them to focus part of the attention on making sure that they know where you need them in terms of reaching those milestones for the gala. What do you want their takeaways to be? At the end of the meeting, how do you want them to feel? Do you want them to be really excited about the work that's coming up? Do you want them to be a little bit nervous because fundraising is down? And then what do you want them to do for the next meeting? They need to have sort of a collective charge. They understand what you need, and they are in a position to to do that for the next meeting. It's really important also to keep in mind that as the executive director, you think about this work all the time. So you are thinking about it right now. It's a Friday afternoon, almost the end of summer. You're probably inside looking at a webinar. You're thinking about the work. You're thinking about the mission. You're thinking about how to make a difference in the lives of the people that are important to your organization. Board members generally only think about this once a month. They think about it when they're in the meeting. They have their own lives and their own work that they're doing. So it's important in terms of positioning information and how you're portraying what's happening in the organization, that you acknowledge that you've got 200 hours of thinking about it since the last time you talked to one of these folks. So how do you connect the dots for them to help them see a continuity with the work you're doing? Is a little bit of a kind of an art form that takes a while to get good at. Reports for board meetings. This is sort of your main way of setting the tone and setting the setting up what's going to happen at the board meetings. I always call it the board packet, so that's the term I'm going to use. Board packet almost always looks like this. You've got an agenda with time frames. I'll show you an example that how time frames can be really important. Minutes from the last meeting. This is sort of a part of this governance requirement that we need to keep track of minutes and keep track of attendance and things like that. I think always need to include financials. Summary financials are fine. Very high level, just a couple bullet points, and then if people have more questions, you can have the additional detail material there. You don't necessarily need to give all the board members the details in the board packet. So the board packet should be tailored to giving them what information you want them to focus on that's important for them to all be on the same page. And then of course they're the board, so they have access to anything. Any information they want to get from you have to give them. But you don't necessarily have to give it to them right up front. There's nothing worse than a board meeting than where you really need to talk about the fundraising goals for the gala, and all of a sudden we're talking about how much money we spent on printing last month versus the month before, or why two numbers don't add up together on a financials. Those are really hard because you only have a limited time window with these folks. So using the board packet to really control the conversation, I think is really key, and is sort of your main tool for doing that. Agendas are your friends. I think they, keep things on track, highlight the things that are important. If a certain part of the work or certain, if the finance committee's report is the most important thing to talk about, giving them extra time. This is how I like to have my agendas. You always have some of this basic stuff, call to order, approve the minutes. I love to have these time things there, because then if we get in the middle of this and the finance committee is joining on, you can then say, okay, I just want to keep us on track. It's 10:05 and we still have two other committee reports to get through. That's kind of your best way to keep the meeting going. There are board personalities that just love to be there, and they haven't gotten to talk about this stuff in a while, and they want to feel important, so they want to say smart things. Publishing in the document, how much time is allotted for each thing, I think can be really helpful. I think also starting out with your executive director report, this is how you bring everyone back together, back on the same page. Again, they haven't thought about you in a month, so your report is really, catching everyone up quickly, getting everyone on the same page. This is a great time for, we call kind of mission moment things, highlighting something really great that happened programmatically, even if it was, one individual kid who's reads slightly better this month than he read last month. Those touch points are really great to remind the board why we're all here, what's important, what should be the focus of all of our decisions and actions in the meeting. So putting your piece first gives you the opportunity to really set the tone. And then you can see how easy the agendas look if you've got committees, right? You don't have to have a finance report or any of this stuff to put together. that becomes the committee's responsibility. And then, whoever's in charge of speaking for that committee, they just get time in the agenda, and then, old business, new business, and then you're done. So that's one of the reasons I like committee structure, and also, why I love having times on these agendas. A couple other thoughts on board meetings, and I'll try to go through this fairly quickly. Use the chat window if you need to. Ask any questions so that I can make sure we talk them at the end. Other thoughts, kind of generally in board meetings, there is a constant battle against derailing the meetings. You've got a lot of different personalities. Board members tend to have pretty big personalities and pretty big opinions on things. That's why we love them and why we have them involved in the organization. It's hard to get folks like that always on the same page about things. Your job, to keep the meeting going using kind of structural tricks, I think is helpful. Again, like the timings, we've only got 15 minutes for this. How things are ordered in the agenda, all of that thoughtfulness that goes into the planning really pays off in how the meetings, take place, and how everyone can stay on track and focus on the things that you want them to focus on. Your board members need to hear how great everything is. There's we're always kind of about to run out of money. We're always having some sort of problem. Me personally, I know that I tend to get very sort of focusing on the things that aren't working more than I focus on the things that are working, because I want to fix the things that aren't working. The board doesn't necessarily need to hear all of that, but they do need to be excited and engaged about the things that are going well. Ultimately, you don't run the meeting. Unless you are an executive director who is also on the board chair is the person who is running the meeting and is responsible for ultimately the things that happen in that room. So working closely with them to make sure that you're on the same page about what discussions you want to focus on, what things are important to you, what you want to highlight with the full board, and then what you want them to do, kind of what's their action that you need from the board at the end of the meeting, if it's fundraising or if it's inviting people to the gala or if it's finding new board members, that the kind of call to action at the end of this, you need to be on the same page with the board chair in the meetings, because ultimately they're the one who are going to keep the conversation moving. Board meetings are, I don't know if this is an actual legal requirement. It is a standard way of dealing with meetings that are called parliamentary. So this is Congress and stuff like that. They use a system called Robert's Rules of Order, which is I used to have a copy of it. It's a big book with a lot of really awful words. I mean, it's a hard read. Understanding the basics of this, if this is not a way of running meetings that you're familiar with, there's some tools online you can find. I'm happy to suggest some. You can also just kind of Google and see what basics of Robert's Rules of Orders kind of brings up for you. But this is how meetings should be run, and most board meetings are run. So understanding the mechanics of that can be really helpful. And then there's a lot of what the board is supposed to do and how meetings look, and sometimes the numbers of officers, or if there are committees, these are in your bylaws of the organization. If you're starting out, you might have just grabbed bylaws from online, or somebody who sent you a copy of theirs. So it might not be something you're actually that familiar with. It's a good idea to go through that document and really see and understand what it says the board is supposed to do, and what decisions need to be made at the board level or at the committee level. So go through that. Sometimes it says things that you might not even realize that are in there. Depending on what state you're in, sometimes the state rules defer to what's in the bylaws for how to run meetings. So just familiarize yourself with your own bylaws so you can have more tools in your belt for how to manage your board effectively. I think ultimately, I think of board meetings as marketing. I don't know if this is helpful for anyone else, but in my mind, board meetings are your opportunity to market to the board about what's happening with the organization and what you want them to do. Again, from our kind of sales focus that we took in the fundraising webinars. Marketing is actions designed to make people do something. And we'll talk next week about kind of the difference in marketing and branding, but board meetings are really kind of marketing. You're kind of selling the board on how great things are going or how certain things need fixing. You want them to leave the meeting feeling excited, ready to go tell all their friends how great the work is, ask their friends for money, or do kind of whatever actions are that you need them to do in the plan. But that's the idea of intentional actions to make people do something. It's kind of a marketing opportunity. So I think for me that's helpful. It's not as much a governance. It's not as much of a checking in to see how all the financials are. It's when I'm running a board meeting, it's my opportunity to make the board do things that I want them to do. And there's a lot of nuance and strategy and art. It takes a while to kind of get that, but ultimately I think that board meetings are more marketing than anything else. Yeah, because what do you want your board to do? How can you use the tools that you have in your reports and your structure and your agenda and the information that you give them? How can you use all of those tools to be part of your plans of that? At the end of the meeting, they know what they're supposed to do. They're excited about it, and they're able to go out and do it. I'll go through these really quick because I know we're at 11 o'clock. Just a couple FAQs, and again, if you've got any specific questions, you can put them in the chat window, and I'll talk about them at the end. Some things that come up a lot in thinking about the boards. One of them is this minimum give amount. Should board members be required to financially give money to the organization as a condition of being on the board? Sometimes that it's phrased as a give or get. So, you either have to give money or, go out and fundraise from somebody else who has, that amount of money. I think it's yes to everything. I think that there is a professionalism that happens when you require your board members to be financially contributing to the organization. And it doesn't have to be much. I mean, it could be $100, it could be $50, it could be $500. I think more important than the dollar amount is it sets the tone that this work costs money and requires us to fundraise, requires us to be in what can be uncomfortable situations, asking people for money or applying for grants. But that is a reality of this world that we live in, trying to do mission-based work. And I don't think it's something to be shy about or to kind of make excuses for. I think it's part of the world we're in, and making that part of your conversation with board members helps them also understand that it's part of the world we're in. So I could go, that's a soapbox thing I have. I could talk about that for 20 more minutes maybe. So I think yes. I don't think there's no real requirement. It's kind of a best practices thing. I think, yeah. How many board members should we have? There's a rule that I really like. I can't remember where I heard this, but your board should be, of course, bigger than the required amount that you have to have by the state, but it should be enough that you can personally connect with each board member once a month. So that varies based on the time of work that it takes you to do. But I think that's a good rule of thumb, again, because the board is part of this work, and you as the executive director and the leader of the organization need to continually nurture those relationships and make people feel like part of this work, make them feel like their contributions are valid and valued. So standing coffees with individual board members once a month, I think is a huge benefit and a huge way to make sure that you're giving the time and the kind of professionalism to the board individuals that they deserve and that is important for them to get, so they stay engaged. Do board members know what they're doing? I think not always. I think there's a lot of board members that don't know and are not familiar with how boards are supposed to function, what their role is. So I wouldn't assume that somebody on the board knows what they're supposed to be doing. So I think that becomes your job as executive director, working with existing board members who might be good at this, um, to really help new folks understand how to do their job well. It helps them connect with the other people on the board, and I think you can use your board, strategically use people who are good at this already, or maybe who have been with the organization for a while, to help new people get up to speed and understand, what is required of them in this role as a board member. Should the executive director be on the board? I think there are some states where you're not allowed to do this. Personally, I don't think so. And this is kind of just a personal opinion of this. I think where you ultimately want to get to with your organization as it grows is that you want to have a well-functioning, independent board of directors that runs alongside you in achieving your goals for the mission of the organization. So I think that's the goal. You being on the board kind of takes some of that away, because the board is never kind of going to grow up and develop its own sense of presence and gravity if you are also on it, because now it's just kind of your show in the board. It's already your show running the organization. I think it's nice to have those separate so that you can work towards that ultimate goal of having a independent board that's in sync with what you're doing, leading the organization. You'll get more value out of it. And if you're in a small organization, you got enough stuff on your plate. You don't need to run the board also. That's too much work. Term limits, I don't know, this is maybe too far down the road. There are people that have passionate opinions about, should board members serve for 2 years and then not be on the board anymore. I personally think that the only thing that should take you off being on a board is being a bad board member, right? Or not showing up to meetings, or not doing what you're supposed to do. I don't think time as a function has any relevance in the value that an individual is contributing to the board. So I personally don't think so. Again, it's a matter of preference and a matter of what your bylaws say. If I have a great board member, I'd like to keep them for 1,000 years, and they're going to grow in their role. They're going to grow in their economic capacities to give, and their friends are going to become richer over time. So you're going to get more out of people, I think, that the longer they're part of the organization generally. If they start shirking their responsibilities or being a bad board member, that's how those should be the determinations of when someone turns off, not just time arbitrarily, I think. But again, that's a personal preference and something that may be in your bylaws already. Directors and officers insurance. Sometimes the acronym for this is D&O insurance. This is sometimes a term that comes up if you haven't encountered it before. D&O insurance is a separate insurance policy you can buy that protects board members and directors, so directors and officers, from personal liability if something, if the nonprofit gets sued, for something. These plans are usually pretty cheap, because it's not a high likelihood that somebody is going to sue the nonprofit to the level that they also want to sue the board members because they think it's the board members' fault. Part of that fiduciary responsibility thing we talked about in the beginning does make people running an organization legally liable in certain cases, for the acts of the organization. So there are some board members that won't be on a board without this. So just as a term, if you haven't heard it and didn't know what it was, that's what it is. It's a separate policy that you can buy. It's usually a lot cheaper than your other insurance policies. But if somebody asks for it and they're going to be a great board member, it's worth looking into. These are just a couple things at the end. I don't know we'll talk too much about it because I know we're out of time. I think, all of that sounds great. Like in this presentation, that's sort of like your best case scenario, your best world of how this works. In execution, there's a lot of nuance in working with boards. And one of them is this idea of a leadership paradox you get into, because, you need the board's help to do the work, and to grow the work and to continue to do your mission of your organization. But at the same time, you have to be the expert who knows everything so that the board is confident that you are the perfect person for this job. So there's always a little bit of a balancing act there, and sometimes it's hard to find direction or to find where, as an executive director, you can go for advice on things. Because you don't always want to go to the board. You need the board to understand that you need help, doing the work, but you can't always ask them for things because they're also your boss. I mean, think of it, in even a more simpler term. If you're working in a job, you can't always be asking your boss how to do something because eventually the boss might say, "Well, who is this, person? Why do I have to, why did I hire them? They don't know what they're doing." So uh, it's a nuanced thing. I think having a good personal relationship with the chair of your board is critical to navigating this because then you can maybe kind of break out of that professional role to having a more personal um, relationship with your board. Uh, this is also another reason why sort of community and collaborative learning is important among executive directors or leaders of different organizations, because sometimes those are the only people you can talk to. You can't, always talk to your staff about things you're worried about. You can't always talk to the board about things you're worried about. So sometimes it can be lonely, in that world if you've got questions. So one of the things we're trying to do with Tiny Opera House, I'll show you, we're starting very kind of slowly and early in this process, but building a community of folks who are running small nonprofits, who are new to this, who have questions, who can sort of learn from each other in a sort of safe environment. Anyways, it's a little bit of a dance and execution for how to work with the board, and part of it's this kind of leadership paradox we're in. Diversity in board members is a huge topic, especially in more established organizations. Like a lot of American institutions, people who are running boards of directors, not only for for-profit companies, but also in nonprofits, tend to be, kind of old white men a lot of times. So there is a big movement and a big interest in the nonprofit sector, as well as in, other sort of these American kind of older institutions to see how we can bring new voices in to be part of this conversation, to be part of the leadership. Boards especially are tricky because there is sort of a kind of a leadership development trajectory that needs to happen for someone to be, a great board member. I think as a small organization, you've got a really important role to play because you don't need as much from your board members as bigger organizations do, right? If you're a $10 million, $20 million organization, you need very certain types of people that have all this experience doing boards. You don't have as much flexibility in bringing in new people and new voices and new ideas to the board. When you're smaller and you don't need as much, I think it's a great sort of universe, making the universe better thing that we can do as small organizations is to bring in people from different backgrounds, from different ethnicities and genders, and whatever sort of personal identifiers seem important in the work, and be their sort of entry and learning into how to be part of this philanthropy universe. I think is really important. I wish we could spend a whole hour talking about that, but I think as organizations sort of on the ground level, on the front lines of doing this work, you can be part of this bigger narrative that helps change how the Red Cross and the United Way and the symphonies and all these sort of bigger institutions, how they're run by starting this leadership pipeline of new voices and faces and perspectives and ideas, into running some of these kind of older kind of American institutions. Again, we can talk for a whole hour about that. I think it's a big hot topic. I want to at least mention it in here, and have it be part of the conversation. And we can talk for an hour about this too. It's hard to give up control, right? If you started this nonprofit, giving up some of your control to the board for them to be independently empowered to do the work along with you is uncomfortable. And sucks a lot of times. I don't have any advice for you. Actually, I mean, it's a learning curve that you go through as a leader. How you're going to get farther with more people on your team. But sometimes that means you've got to give up some control of the organization, and that's uncomfortable sometimes. That's why it's good to have a community and people you can talk to kind of learn best practices for that. I've done this myself. I had an organization I was running before I moved to a different city, and I didn't have a strong board built up. So when I moved, the organization sort of shut down, and it was sad to see that I had kind of failed as a leader in how I built that organization because I didn't think about, how is this thing going to survive after me? We're all not going to be in the roles. The roles we're in today are not the roles we're going to be in 5 years. So, you know, the board can be that sort of continuity, long term way to look out and ensure that this work keeps getting done. A couple ways that we can help as Tiny Opera House. Again, we do these type of webinars. Your feedback is really important for this, so that we can continue to make these better and more useful. We're really trying to tailor these kind of big nonprofit concepts to folks who are running small organizations or who are running new organizations. The approach is very different than if you're trying to find a new board member for the symphony. Like, that's a whole different animal than if you're trying to build a board that you filed the paperwork with your mom and your sister on there just so you could get the organization created, but now you've got to really think about how do you build this from scratch. So all of our webinars, all of our educational programs are targeted in that way for people who are new to this or on the smaller scale of organizations. We do have a Facebook forum that I built last week based on some feedback from a prior webinar. If you like an invitation for that, it's going to be, I think it was in the email I sent out. It'll be in the follow-up as well. There's only a handful of folks in there right now, but I hope that continues to grow and continues to be a place that you can ask questions, both of people who are in a similar leadership position as you, and there's also some subject matter experts that I've asked to be kind of monitoring that forum. So if you've got specific fundraising advice questions, that there's a development officer who can help you answer those. And we still do our one-on-one consultations if there's things that you need. Our platform, the financial management platform that we have at Tiny Opera House, is built to make reporting to the board really easy. That was one of the kind of big driving factors on how we designed it. So if you haven't checked that out, or if you're struggling with QuickBooks or Xero or whatever, kind of bigger, big business financial management software things are out there, it's worth taking a look at what we have and how we can make it easy. And it's also only $10 a month, so it's really cheap. So you'll save money. But it's designed to be able to, push button print dashboards so that you can, give the board the information they need. Next week, we've got a couple more of these in this series. Next week, we're going to be talking about marketing and branding and how those are different things. Both are important in getting the word out about the work you're doing and how to get people to show up and volunteer and attend events and things like that. It's going to be a fun one because we'll talk about some actual tools to we're going to talk about fonts. I love talking about fonts. We're going to talk about, building a color palette and how to make it look like your documents are all put together by a really expensive graphic designer, but it's really just you. Those things go a long way. Again, this continuing theme that we have for, mostly for startup organizations of trying to look like you're a real big nonprofit, how your visuals present themselves has a lot to do with that. So that's kind of our main focus on the marketing branding, is how do you look like a nonprofit that's got a whole fleet of designers when it's just basically you doing the work. Any questions about anything? I know we went long. It's a lot of information. Again, I'll circulate the PowerPoint that's got some of these specific things. If you've got any questions, you can put them in that chat window. I'll probably just follow up with you in email if you've got questions, because I don't want to keep anyone else who's on with us. But thanks for being here. Thanks for spending some time. Thanks for being invested enough in the work that you're doing to seek out educational opportunities and ways to be better at this. Um, we are all part of a community at Tiny Opera House that have gone through this or are currently going through it. And there's a lot of us, but it's not a common experience that everyone has. So, you know, thanks for being part of that and helping us, continue to provide services for folks who are changing the world with small nonprofits. And here's my contact information if you have questions for follow-ups. And thanks again for being here.